Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to another FIDE Candidates recap for round 9 brought to you by Lichess.org. My name is Aakaash Meduri, National Master from Chicago. You can call me Aakaash Money, that's my handle there. And let's just get right to the action. This was a pretty interesting round. So just to recap on who are the top leaders in the tournament so far going into this round, we have Jan Nepomniachtchi with 5 out of 8 points in clear first place, and then Fabiano Caruana and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with 4.5 out of 8. Both of these two are tied, but Fabi does have the head-to-head tiebreaker score on MVL after yesterday's breathtaking win. So very interesting stuff, and let's get right to it. So starting off with Alexenko versus Caruana, the two men of the hour, two winners from round 8. Let's see what happened in their game. So e4, e5, we go into an Italian game, very topical at the top level, some very interesting stuff. It's called the Giuco Piano, but I've often found that the name is a little bit of a misnomer, and this position gets pretty interesting quite quickly. So h3, bishop b6, kind of a slightly offbeat move, not like it hasn't been seen at the top level, but more common here is the move a5 to keep some room for the bishop on a7. But Fabiano goes bishop b6, and I believe he's had this in a couple of games against other very strong players as well. So knight bd2, knight e7, d4, knight c6, goes back to c6 to keep an eye out on this d4 pawn, a4, a5, and then bishop a2. A very intriguing move by Alexenko, sacrificing this pawn on d4 for some compensation. So this bishop on a2 clears the way for the knight on d2 to hop into c4, and then target this potentially awkward bishop on b6 after the move a5. This square is slightly shakier. Very neural net-like sacrifice. Not really sure where the concrete lines are, but of course Alexenko has prepared this at home. So takes, knight c4, takes, knight takes b6, c2, queen c2, and c takes b6. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. White does have the bishop pair. Black has a shattered pawn structure. This d6 pawn is looking extremely weak. So perhaps this is slightly better for white, but Caruana is Caruana, number 2 in the world for a reason. So we're going to go ahead and skip to part of the middle game. And rook d5, so we have this position where Caruana goes knight takes b2. And I found this position really interesting because you have a situation where black has 6 pawns, whereas white only has 4 pawns. So at a cursory glance, it looks like black should be doing much better. But actually, the activity of white's pieces are such that Alexenko can regain the pawns quite quickly. And so what he does is he plays rook c1 to rope in this knight on b2 and guarantee that he'll be able to win material back. So after rook f7, rook c2, attacking the knight on b2, knight a4, rook c4, knight b2, rook c2. So we've got a repetition kind of coming into play, knight a4, rook c4, and Caruana, if he decided that he wanted the draw, he could just go back knight b2, and then you'd have a threefold repetition. However, he does choose to play knight to c5, inviting bishop c5 takes, rook takes c5, and the game continues on for a little bit here, but after most of the pieces get traded and it goes into this rook endgame, it's a pretty straightforward draw, as you can see. If we turn on the engine, Stockfish 13 at a depth of 44 gives this even Stevens 0.0. And eventually the game ends in a draw. Of course, in this position, Alexenko has king g6 and the pawn gets captured. So good game, very interesting stuff from Alexenko, but Fabiano played pretty resourcefully to deal with this kind of unusual looking position after bishop a2, and Fabi moves on to 5 out of 9, so keeping his positive score, whereas Alexenko has 4 out of 9, so he's -1, but he's the greenest member of the candidates group, so not a bad score for the newcomer. Okay, so next we'll go to the game between the Russians, it is Alexander Grischuk versus Jan Nepomniachtchi. Grischuk lost a tough game against Alexenko yesterday, and he's looking to bounce back from that. So d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. The topical Grunfeld, always topical Grunfeld, comes into play here. Takes, knight takes, e4, and bishop g7, knight f3, c5, rook b1, castle h3. I wanted to highlight this h3 move because what it's really doing is preventing the black bishop from coming to g4, and when the bishop comes to g4, this pawn on d4 gets kind of shaky, and the pawn on d4 is oftentimes the topic of conversation in the Grunfeld. You know, the Grunfeld is a very hyper-modern opening, and so trying to chip away at this pawn is typically how black plays. So knight c6, d5. A very interesting move, giving up the pawn on c3 to stake out some space in the center of the board. Now takes, bishop d2, takes, queen takes, knight d4, knight d4, c d4, bishop c4. I believe this is a novelty. I think probably more common is queen takes d4, but what Grischuk is saying is it's going to be really difficult to long-term hold this pawn, so he's really in no hurry. He'd rather fortify this strong center that he has. And notice how this central complex actually conflicts with the light-squared bishop that black has, so there's some cramping of the space going on here. And queen d6, f4, and as I said, plenty of compensation for Grischuk right now. He's not really too worried about being down a pawn. So we'll go ahead and skip to an interesting part of the middle game here. This game ends pretty quickly, but bishop c4, and it looks kind of straightforward. Maybe bishop takes here, rook takes c4, rook takes f7, and you know there's stuff going on here. But perhaps d3 works here, rook e7, rook takes d6, and this should probably end up being a draw after rook ff7, and white will be able to force the repetition. But Grischuk chooses not to go for bishop takes c4. He makes this really interesting move, rook takes f7. And the Indians don't like it so much because they see an interesting opportunity for black. But rook takes f7, so potentially offering an exchange sacrifice here. So Nepo did not choose to go for that. Nepo went bishop takes b3. But what happens after bishop takes f7? Rook takes f7, a4, trying to interfere with this bishop. If bishop takes a4, of course, king takes f7. So bishop d5. And I believe the engine gives king h8 here, but you can totally understand why Nepo did not choose to go into this, because it's really kind of difficult to evaluate this position, and especially if you take a look at the move number, it is move 26. They haven't reached move 40 yet, so there's a lot of considerations that need to be made here. And whether or not you want to play into the complications before you reach time control, it's a really crucial decision at this high level. So kind of understandable that Nepo decided that, you know, he was not going to have any of that nonsense. He just wanted to simplify the position. So he goes bishop b3 takes, rook takes d6. And I'd like to also point out that, you know, just going back here, even if Nepo decided to take this, a lot of people, when they're watching these live commentaries, they look at the engine and they say, oh, these players don't know what they're doing. But the reality of the situation is humans play like humans and engines play like engines. So can't be very critical of Nepo here. And eventually, just after a few moves, a lot of material ends up getting liquidated. And this is just about to be a draw, but they're on move 36, so they make a couple of moves. And once they reach time control, this is a very easy draw. Pawns both on the same side of the square, so neither of these two are going to play this on. So the game ended in peace. And Nepo moves on to 5.5 out of 9, whereas Grischuk is 4 out of 9. So Nepo is still doing quite well, actually still in the lead after this round. Grischuk, you know, maybe he didn't get what he wanted out of this opening, but you can't complain. Getting a draw against someone like Jan is still an impressive feat. So we'll go ahead and go into the next game. That was between Ding Liren and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. MVL did lose, of course, that very intense game against Fabiano yesterday. So looking to make a comeback. He's not trying to be a slouch, especially in the second half of the event. And let's see what happens. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, probably signaling a Grunfeld once again. And Ding goes h4, which, you either look at this move and you think, oh, this is a Blitz-Potzer move, or you think, whoa, this is probably something interesting. And h4 is coming into style in a lot more of these types of positions nowadays, largely because they're endorsed by the neural nets. The neural nets love these early flank pawn pushes. They love grabbing space on the side of the board and potentially creating some problems for the enemy. And so as we see here, this h-pawn definitely does have an impact early on in the game. So knight f3, knight g4, and h5 already on move 10, even before white has castled, playing h4, h5. And a point to note here, it's better to do this before you castle because the rook is already on h1. The rook is already well situated to take advantage and perhaps cause some problems for the enemy side. So queen e7, bishop g5, and this is a very interesting point in the game. MVL goes bishop takes c3, which, at first glance might not make that much sense because oftentimes the bishop on g7 is really the MVP of the position for black. It controls the long diagonal, and coupled with these pawns, these dark squares are completely in black's control. So it might seem a little bit unusual that MVL decides to do bishop takes c3, but he does it for a pretty distinctive reason. Bishop c3, bc3, f6, bishop d2, and g5. So just notice the colors of these pawns, pawns on f6, pawns on g5, dark squares. Imagine if there was still a bishop here. Well, if there is still a bishop here, that bishop wouldn't be too happy, the pawns being blockers for his own range. So after the exchange of the dark squared bishop, it makes a lot more sense to situate these pawns on dark squares. And potentially MVL is asking Ding, okay, so now that you have your pawn on h5, what do you plan on doing? There's no more ideas with h takes g6 looming in the air. So a very interesting positional transformation that MVL chose to do. So castle, knight e5, and knight d4. So this move, at first, I had no idea what this move did. It looks like the knight is just being thrown into the wilderness. After takes, I was wondering, okay, how does black proceed here? And there's some interesting lines here. So MVL went castling in the game and just chose to give up the pawn. But let's take a look at if he decides to keep the knight. Knight f7, rook e1, castle, bishop d3. So not only uncovering the rook onto the e file, but also scoping in on this h7 square now that the black king has castled. So queen d8, rook b1, rook e8, queen c2, knight f8, rook e8, queen e8, rook e1, queen d7. And then this very interesting move, bishop takes h7. Now this pawn on h5 is actually doing something very useful. And I think this just demonstrates how these early flank pawn pushes can be extremely useful, even if you can't see how they're going to be useful when you play 3h4. They can end up being assets for you in the middle game. So knight h7, queen g6. And if king h8, h6 is very strong. White is already probably much better, if not winning here. But then there's this interesting move, king f8. And then if h6 here, knight takes h6, queen takes h6. And really hard to say what's happening here. It's probably equal. And could have been an interesting way for MVL to play if he decided to go knight f7 instead of just giving up the piece. But he decides to just give up the piece, with castle, and of course Ding does do d takes e5, f takes e5, and what have we got here? We have a position where the pawn structure is a little bit unusual. It's kind of open, kind of closed, I'd say probably semi-open, but white does have the bishop pair, and so white should be preferred in this position, and indeed, if you look at Stockfish 13, it does give plus 1.7 for white, so one should think that Ding should be able to convert this position. Now we'll jump ahead a little bit into the middle game, because there's a lot that happens. There's a lot that happens in the middle game, so actually we'll jump to the early end game. And so what we have in this position is it's just a heavy piece endgame. Equal pawns still, but there are some interesting characteristics about this position. For one, this d5 pawn is a passer, and so white is still preferred. It looks like white does definitely have control of the position, as Stockfish says, plus 2.8. So Ding is looking to try to take advantage of MVL's position and squeeze this to get his first win. No, actually not his first win. He did beat Fabiano earlier in the tournament, but his second win and climbing up in the standings. So queen d4, rook b1, rook f7. Rook f7 is an interesting try by MVL, but unfortunately it doesn't work. It seems to signal with the rook f7 that he wants to pile up on the f-file and focus on this pawn, and if he's able to ever capture this pawn, maybe this e4 pawn is a useful asset. However, this is actually a blunder, and Ding had this move rook takes b6, and if we look at this move, there's like a lot of different variations that could happen. I was wondering personally what happens after rook e f8. The engine gives this interesting line, which is very crisp, very just silicon machine-like, how to just clear up when you're winning a position and convert very easily. Rook g6, rook e7, force an exchange of the rooks, and then rook c6. And now, with white about to capture this c5 pawn, it's an easily winning endgame. So rook e f8 doesn't work, but what about something like rook f5? Rook f5, queen c2, king h7, rook g6, and it's still a tough position for black, but maybe this is something that MVL would have preferred versus this is something that MVL could have done had rook takes b6 happened, but probably still better for Ding, and I'm gonna guess Ding would be able to convert this if he's careful. So instead, what happens in the game after rook f7, Ding goes rook d1. Misevaluating this position, I don't know how much of this was time pressure. It looks like on Lichess, it says that he has 14 minutes versus 38 minutes for MVL, and he spent about 5 minutes deciding on whether or not to take rook takes b6, and perhaps he saw some complications while calculating, and he wasn't confident enough to just do rook takes b6 and go into a winning position. Unfortunately for him, though, this is basically how he gives up the game, and after a few more moves, we get into this queen and rook endgame, and there's a bunch of moves here, but ultimately it's a whole lot of nothing that's happening. Lots of checks. Ding is just poking and prodding, trying to get MVL to crack, but you know, players at this level don't crack very easily, and after move 88 they do agree to a draw. So with this result, Ding is at 3.5 out of 9, unfortunately still at the bottom of the rankings, whereas MVL is 5 out of 9, so still +1. I think, especially kind of being worse in this game, he's got to feel happy. Ding is an incredibly strong player, and after yesterday's loss against Fabiano, this has got to make him feel at least a little bit better. So the last game of the round, we have Anish Giri versus Wang Hao, and this game, very masterful display of just technique from Anish Giri. So d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, and Anish plays the Catalan. And I'm going to have to give just a shout out to Grandmaster Srinath from Chessable. I've been personally going through this course, the Lifetime Repertoire's Catalan course, and so this game was of particular interest. Got to learn from the best of the best and how to play your openings. So a lot of just kind of standard stuff happens here. If you're interested, just kind of study some model games in the Catalan for what's happening here. This is all well-trodden theory. And after move 15, or is it 15? No, yeah, this point. So move 16, this is actually a novelty, so h3. And I was really confused. I was watching some of the commentary when this move happened, and a lot of the commentators were praising this move. I didn't really understand what the whole big deal was about this move, and it might seem a little bit confusing to you. But to understand this, you have to really like internalize what is the defining strategic feature of the Catalan for white. Well, the Catalan is a game of maneuvering, strategic play. It's kind of a waiting opening, but it's an opening that heats up to a simmer. And white is really just trying to see when black will falter, and then when he can take advantage of it. So let's just see what happens a few moves later. So queen b6, queen e2, c5. And take a look at this pawn structure. It's kind of an unusual pawn structure. Looks a little bit like a sailboat to me. But this pawn structure versus Wang Hao's pawn structure, very standard pawn structure versus Giri's. This is actually an incredibly strong complex for white. If you just look at these pawns on e3 and f4, they're controlling these very important and very key squares on e5 and d4, which allows Giri to anchor his knight and his rook here. Not to mention, the g file's open, so if Giri decides he wants to attack, he can attack. And there's no easy way for black to attack the king. The king is open per se, but it's not really open. The king has nothing to fear. There's not going to be any mating attack on the horizon for Wang Hao. So a very deep and interesting idea from Giri to play this h3 move. So we'll skip to move 26. I think there's an interesting point here. So queen d7, knight f6, queen d6. So a waiting game again. Anish is just slowly improving his pieces. If you look at this rook, it's a beautiful rook controlling the c file. The knight is still perfectly placed on e5, and this queen is just looming here, taking control of the space and really looking for some weaknesses that Wang Hao will create perhaps by himself. And actually, that's exactly what happens. This move g6. And why is this move not very good? Well, the thing about this position is there are not any clear weaknesses yet to target. Sure, you can maybe argue that, okay, these b7 and a5 pawns are potentially weak, but it's not really that big of a deal. And if Giri decides to try to attack one of these pawns with like maybe rook c5 and then queen b6, well, black's not just going to sit here. Black's going to try to launch his own counterattack. So like rook c5, rook d8 already looks very compelling for black, and then maybe rook d1, king h2, followed by something like b6, and then all of a sudden, when I said that there were there's no ideas of mate, well, now there potentially are. So the point I'm trying to make here is that black doesn't have any serious weaknesses to worry about yet, and the problem with a move like g6 is it does start to create some weaknesses. So a tip that I'll try to give if you're playing a stronger opponent and you have this type of position where you're trying to hold, try to hold for as long as you can. Don't make moves that are going to create weaknesses. So this g6 square weakens, or this g6 push weakens the f6 square, and as we'll see, it becomes a very important factor later on in the game. So g6, I added a question mark to that. B3, h5, and it's interesting to note once again actually I'll color these red, how the pawn structure for black compares to the pawn structure for white. With these dark squares being covered, black is forced to put all of his pawns on light squares, and that further weakens the dark squares in black's camp. So even though white doesn't have a dark square bishop, white can still do a lot of stuff, especially with the queen being able to control the dark squares. So if we just go ahead, king h2, king g7, the rest of this is just a very nice display of technique from Giri. So he plays b4 to exchange off this advanced a pawn, and then instead of immediately capturing, a very classy move by Giri, rook to c4, threatening to do rook takes b4 and double up on the b file, where he will be able to attack this this weak b7 pawn. So b3 and rook b4, queen a7, and actually I should say queen a7 is actually a blunder here. So queen a7 is kind of a passively defending move, and we'll see what happened in the game, and then I'll show you what the engine is suggesting black should do. So rook takes b3, queen takes a4, rook takes b7. If you see, material is equal, yet Stockfish is giving a brutal +5 for Giri, already saying that Giri is winning here. And now if you take a look, this queen is perfectly positioned to target this knight on f6, and now it's really starting to become clear why this g6 move was so bad. Now there's a lot of problems that black has to contend with. So queen e8, rook a7, preparing to go queen b7 potentially, rook d5, queen b7, knight e4, and then knight takes f7. This is the final move in the game. Wang Hao throws in the towel. There's not really any feasible way to stop these very deadly discoveries. For example, like after knight g5, I don't really see much for black to hope for here. The queen's coming into g7, and that will be checkmate no matter where the king goes. So a really nice demonstration from Giri on how to just convert this position after rook c4, rook b4, and then breaking through onto the 7th rank. You know, they call a rook on the 7th rank a pig, so this pig was very hungry. So queen a7, the passively defending move, unfortunately does not work, and it looks like Wang Hao is already in time pressure with only 41 seconds on his clock. I believe that's correct, yeah, 41 seconds. But what were the alternatives here? So actually the engine is giving this queen d6 move. So passive defense can work, but if there's a way for your opponent to break through, it's not going to work. So when that is not an option on the table, you got to go for active defense, and that's what the engine is giving. So let's just see the line that the engine spit out. Rook takes b3, queen d1. So not just sitting idly, and it is kind of scary for sure. Like what happens after rook takes b7, this pawn is still extremely fragile, but the engine has no emotions. The engine shows no fear. Rook d2, rook takes f7, king h6, and rook d7, a very interesting move. If rook takes f6, of course, rook takes b2. So instead of that, rook d7, pinning the rook to the queen, and rook takes b2, rook takes d1, rook f2, king g1, rook a2, knight f7. And so this position is still better for white. Let's just turn on the engine. It's not better by that much, plus 0.9, but definitely a variation that Wang Hao, if he was given the option to go back in time, he would definitely be going back in time to play this out with queen d6 instead of queen a7. So I think the takeaway here is consider what type of defense you have to play in a position. Passive defense or active defense. Sometimes passive defense is okay. Like, I think in this position, playing passively, I forget the move that the engine was giving. I think queen e8, just holding on. It is definitely a passive move, but I guess it does attack a4. Whereas in this position, instead of queen a7, active defense is the right way to play. So kind of a takeaway when you're worse, how to evaluate the position. Okay, and so with that, Giri moves on to 5 out of 9, so he joins the plus score club, whereas Wang Hao is, with that loss, he is 4 out of 9. So they were both previously tied at 4 out of 8, and now Giri does move on to the plus score club. So that was like my favorite game of the round, and let's just take a look at what the standings are real quick. So Jan is still at 5.5 out of 9. Fabi, Giri, and MVL are tied up with 5 out of 9, although of course MVL is kind of the loser on the head-to-head score there. And then Alexenko, Wang Hao, and Grischuk with 4 out of 9. Ding Liren, 3.5 out of 9, still not having the greatest tournament. So it's kind of crazy because with this being round 9, there are 5 rounds left in the tournament. And it's going to be extremely interesting to see, like, all of these top 4 players have a chance of winning. And if we look at who Nepo has to play, he still has to play Fabi, MVL, Alexenko, and Wang Hao, and Ding. So he's got some tough pairings. I mean, everyone has tough pairings in this event. But, you know, he does have the lead, but we'll have to see whether or not any of the other 3 behind him will be able to catch up. So anyone's game. I'm super excited. Hopefully you guys are also excited. This has once again been such a treat to see high-level chess after so long. And with that, thank you guys for watching the Round 9 recap. If you like this video, make sure you smash that like button. Subscribe to the Lichess YouTube channel. Also, if you love Lichess, do consider becoming a patron. You get a sexy wing badge next to your handle. And it does support the website, Lichess being a nonprofit. If you also liked my commentary, you can check out my Twitch and YouTube channels, twitch.tv/Aakaash, AAKAASH, youtube.com/Aakaash, same spelling. Alright guys, until next time, peace out.